A quiet city street. A homeless man sits silently on the curb, his face weary, his eyes hidden behind a cloudy haze. Suddenly, a police officer looms over him, yelling, his hand gripping the man's collar. The tension builds as bystanders gather, cameras in hand. But then, a black limousine pulls up, and a powerful figure steps out. What happens next will leave you speechless. Watch until the end to see the truth revealed, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do in this situation? Your voice matters. Asterisk. The presidential motorcade rolled through the quiet streets of a small American town under a blazing afternoon sun. Donald Trump, seated comfortably in the back seat of his armored limousine, was sifting through a stack of papers, his mind occupied with the upcoming policy meeting. The soundproof interior of the vehicle muted the world outside until something unusual caught his attention through the tinted window. On the side of the road, a commotion was brewing. A uniformed police officer towered over a frail, elderly black man who sat slumped on the curb. The man's clothes were worn and ragged, his posture defeated. The officer gripped the man's collar roughly, barking commands that echoed down the street. Around them, a small crowd of bystanders had gathered, their expressions ranging from concern to disapproval. Some had their phones out, recording the incident. Trump leaned closer to the window, narrowing his eyes. He could see the tension in the scene, the officer's aggressive stance, and the man's apparent helplessness. Without hesitation, Trump pressed the intercom button to speak to his driver. "Stop the car," he ordered firmly. The motorcade slowed to a halt, causing heads to turn. Secret Service agents quickly exited the vehicles, scanning the surroundings for potential threats. Trump stepped out, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the crowd. His imposing figure and unmistakable orange-tinted skin made him a focal point in an instant. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Trump strode toward the scene, his bodyguards close behind. The officer turned to face him, visibly startled. For a moment, the man's authoritative demeanor faltered as he recognized who was approaching. "What's going on here?" Trump demanded, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. The officer straightened, regaining some of his composure. "Mr. President, this individual's causing a disturbance. He's loitering here and refusing to leave." Trump glanced down at the elderly man who remained silent. His face was drawn and pale, his eyes unfocused. Something about the man's gaze struck Trump as odd. He bent slightly, meeting the man's level. "Sir, can you hear me?" Trump asked gently. The man didn't respond immediately, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. After a pause, he nodded weakly. Trump noticed the milky haze in the man's eyes, and realization dawned. "He's blind," Trump stated, his tone incredulous. He straightened, directing a sharp glare at the officer. "You're harassing a blind man?" The officer's expression tightened, but he didn't back down. "With all due respect, sir, he's been sitting here for hours, and we've had complaints. These people are a problem in this area." "These people?" Trump's voice rose. The crowd stirred, sensing the confrontation escalating. "Do you have any idea who this man is, or what he's been through?" The officer hesitated, and Trump pressed further. "Sir, what's your name?" he asked the man, his voice softer now. The man spoke finally, his voice shaky but resolute. "George Harper. I served in Afghanistan. Lost my sight in an explosion." The weight of the words settled over the gathering. The officer shifted uncomfortably, but Trump's expression hardened with a mix of anger and disgust. "You're telling me," Trump said, his voice icy, that you're treating a war veteran like this? A man who fought for this country?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, phones capturing every moment. Trump turned to his security detail. "Get this man some water and help him into the car," he ordered. Then, turning back to the officer, he said, "You're done here. Give me your badge." The officer's face turned red with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Trump interrupted, "is to protect and serve, not intimidate and harass. Badge now." Reluctantly, the officer removed his badge, placing it in Trump's outstretched hand. Trump held it up briefly before handing it to one of his aides. "We'll deal with this later." As George Harper was carefully helped into the presidential vehicle, Trump addressed the crowd. "This stops now," he declared. "No one in this country, especially those who have sacrificed for it, should be treated with such disrespect." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their cameras still trained on the scene. Trump climbed back into his car, his expression set with determination. As the motorcade moved forward, the tension of the encounter lingered in the air, but so did a sense of vindication for George Harper and the many others like him. Inside the armored limousine, the air was tense but purposeful. George Harper sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his fingers still trembling slightly. The blind veteran, now shielded from the glaring sun and hostile officers, seemed unsure of how to react to the sudden shift in his circumstances. Trump, seated across from him, studied the man intently. The president's usual commanding demeanor was tempered by a flicker of empathy. "Mr. Harper," Trump began, his tone unusually soft, "tell me what happened back there. I want to hear it from you." George hesitated, swallowing hard. His voice was quiet but carried an undercurrent of exhaustion and pain. "It's not just today, sir. It's every day. They see me, sitting there, trying to survive, and they think I'm nothing, just another piece of trash on the street. I lost my home, my family, everything. But these cops, they don't care. They come every day, yell at me, push me around. Sometimes they even hit me, just to show they can." Trump leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed. "You're saying this is a pattern? These officers harass you regularly?" George nodded. "Not just me. Others like me too, especially if we're black. They think we don't matter, that no one's watching. But I fought for this country, Mr. President. I lost my sight so people like them could live in peace. And now—" His voice cracked and he turned his head slightly, as if staring into the void. "Now, I'm treated like I don't even exist." Trump's jaw tightened. He glanced toward one of his aides seated near the front of the limousine. "Get me the chief of police for this city on the phone. Now." The aide nodded, immediately pulling out a phone to make the call. George continued, his voice trembling with suppressed anger and shame. "They don't see a man who served. They don't see a person. All they see is a problem to get rid of. Today wasn't the first time they laid hands on me. That officer back there, he's one of the worst. Always calling me names, accusing me of things I didn't do. He acts like he owns the streets." Trump listened intently, his expression darkening with each word. The gravity of the situation was clear, not just as a personal injustice to George, but as a broader symptom of systemic issues. "That's unacceptable," Trump finally said, his voice firm. "You gave your service and your sight for this country. You shouldn't have to fight just to exist. This ends today." The limousine rolled to a stop in front of a nearby veterans center. a place Trump had requested they visit to ensure George received immediate assistance. Secret Service agents opened the door, and George hesitated before stepping out with their guidance. The building was modest but well kept, a beacon of hope in an otherwise harsh environment. As they entered, a staff member quickly approached, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. President, this is an honor," she exclaimed before noticing George. Her smile softened. "And who's this?" Trump placed a firm hand on George's shoulder. "This man is George Harper, a veteran who has been mistreated and neglected for far too long. He needs food, shelter, and medical care. Can you help?" "Of course," she replied warmly, motioning for another staff member to assist George. "We'll make sure he gets everything he needs." George turned his head toward Trump, his voice soft. "Thank you, sir. I don't know why you stopped or why you cared, but thank you." Trump shook his head. "I stopped because it was the right thing to do. No one should have to endure what you've been through." As George was led further into the building, Trump turned back to his aide who had just finished the call. "What did the chief of police say?" he demanded. The aide looked uneasy. "He's hesitant, sir. Says he needs to review the situation before making any statements." Trump's expression hardened. "Tell him he has until tonight to give me answers. If he doesn't, I'll make sure this goes public, and he won't like the attention." The aide nodded, understanding the gravity of the president's words. Trump lingered for a moment, watching as George disappeared into the care of the staff. He felt a sense of satisfaction knowing the man was finally safe, but it wasn't enough. This was just the beginning. As the motorcade prepared to move again, Trump sat back in his seat, his mind racing. George's story wasn't unique, and that infuriated him. He knew the video of the incident would already be spreading online, and public reaction would demand answers. This wasn't just about one man. It was about holding the entire system accountable. As the motorcade rolled forward, Trump's resolve solidified. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The video of the confrontation between Donald Trump and the aggressive police officer had gone viral by the time the presidential motorcade reached its next destination. News outlets were already dissecting every frame, and social media buzzed with both outrage and admiration. Trump, seated in the limousine, was fully aware of the growing storm, but his focus remained on the call he had just received from the city's chief of police. The conversation had been heated, with the chief reluctant to admit any systemic issues within his department. Trump, however, left no room for argument. "I want that officer suspended immediately," he had demanded, "and I want a full report on every complaint filed against your department for the past year. If you don't comply, I'll ensure this city's leadership is held accountable on a national stage." As the motorcade slowed, Trump decided it was time to take the next step. They arrived at a local town hall where community leaders and activists had already gathered after hearing about the incident. A crowd of reporters swarmed outside, their cameras flashing as Trump stepped out, flanked by his security detail. His presence immediately silenced the murmuring crowd inside. The tension in the room was palpable. Many of the attendees were visibly angry, their frustration etched on their faces. Trump took to the podium, his expression serious and commanding. "I'm here today because I saw something unacceptable. A blind veteran, a man who gave everything for this country, was treated with disdain, harassment, and violence by those sworn to protect and serve. This is not just a local issue. This is a national failure, and it's one I refuse to ignore." The room erupted in applause, though some voices called out questions. One man, an older black community leader, stepped forward. "Mr. President," he said firmly, "what are you going to do about it? We've been ignored for too long. Promises aren't enough anymore." Trump nodded, acknowledging the man's frustration. "I hear you," he replied. "That's why I've already ordered an investigation into this city's police department. I want every instance of abuse, harassment, and misconduct brought to light. And it won't stop here. I'll push for federal oversight in any department where this behavior is found. But I need your voices too. Together, we can ensure this doesn't happen again." As the applause swelled again, Trump motioned for his aides to hand out contact information for a special hotline, allowing citizens to report instances of police misconduct directly to federal authorities. The gesture was met with cautious optimism, but many still held skeptical expressions. Trust wouldn't be built overnight. Meanwhile, in the back of the hall, George Harper stood quietly, having been escorted by staff from the Veterans Center. He listened intently, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. As Trump finished his speech, George was ushered forward, and the room fell silent again as the president introduced him. "This is George Harper," Trump said, his hand resting on George's shoulder. "A veteran, a hero, a man who deserves better from all of us. Let his story be the turning point." George, initially hesitant, managed to find his voice. "Thank you," he said, his words trembling but heartfelt. "I didn't think anyone cared anymore, but maybe things can change." The crowd erupted into a standing ovation, their applause echoing through the hall. Trump stepped back, letting George have the moment, but his mind was already working. He knew this was just the beginning. Public support was critical, but real change would require dismantling entrenched systems of abuse and prejudice. As the event concluded, Trump was approached by local activists and civil rights leaders. They presented him with detailed accounts of similar incidents, their evidence meticulously compiled over years of advocacy. Trump promised to review every case personally, his resolve hardening with each story he heard. By the time the motorcade departed, the momentum of the day was undeniable. Reports of the event were already dominating headlines, and the hashtag #JusticeForGeorge was trending across platforms. Trump, seated in the back of the limousine, watched the city lights blur past the window. He knew the fight ahead would be difficult, but he also knew it was necessary. For George, for countless others like him, and for the country itself, this battle was far from over. The limousine hummed quietly as it carried Donald Trump and his team back to the Veterans Center to follow up on George Harper's condition. The atmosphere inside was focused, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on everyone. Trump's face was set in determination, his phone buzzing constantly with updates about the rapidly escalating national attention. Calls were pouring in from news networks, civil rights organizations, and even fellow politicians. Some commending his actions, others accusing him of grandstanding. Trump ignored the noise, focusing instead on the task at hand, ensuring George Harper and others like him received justice. As they arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the center. Some were local veterans who had come to share their own stories, while others were activists and concerned citizens inspired by the viral footage. Trump stepped out of the limousine, flanked by his security detail, and was immediately greeted by cheers and questions. Ignoring the reporters, he motioned to the staff inside to bring George to the lobby, where the veteran was now resting after receiving care. When George appeared, he looked cleaner, calmer and more stable, though the exhaustion of years of neglect still lingered in his posture. Trump approached him and sat beside him on a sturdy bench. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, but Trump's focus remained on the man beside him. "How are they treating you here, George?" Trump asked, his voice quieter than usual, but still firm. George nodded slowly. "They're good people here. For the first time in a long time, I feel safe." He paused, his sightless eyes seeming to search for the right words. "But it's not just me, Mr. President. There are so many others out there, just like me, or worse. They've given up hope because no one ever stops to care." Trump placed a hand on George's shoulder, his expression softening. "That's going to change. I'm making sure of it." Behind them, one of the center's directors stepped forward with a clipboard filled with documents. She introduced herself as Sarah Collins, a longtime advocate for homeless veterans. "Mr. President," she began, "thank you for stepping in today. George isn't the only one who's suffered at the hands of the system. Our veterans deserve better, and we've been pushing for years to get the attention we need. Maybe now, with your support, we can make real progress." Trump took the clipboard and scanned the top pages. They contained detailed accounts of police harassment, lack of resources, and systemic failures that had driven countless veterans into poverty and despair. "I'll take this directly to my team," he assured her, "and I'm going to demand answers from every level of government." Sarah hesitated before adding, "We've also been trying to pass local legislation to protect homeless individuals, especially veterans, from discriminatory policing. It's been blocked repeatedly. Maybe you could help us push it through." Trump's jaw tightened as he handed the clipboard back to his aide. "Send me the full details. I'll make sure this legislation gets the attention it deserves. If anyone tries to block it again, they'll answer to me personally." The room buzzed with approval as Trump rose and addressed the small gathering of veterans, staff, and supporters. "Today isn't just about George Harper," he began. "It's about fixing a broken system that's failed our heroes for too long. If we're going to call ourselves a great nation, we need to act like one. That means protecting those who've sacrificed for us. It means holding people accountable, whether they're wearing a badge or sitting in an office." His words were met with a standing ovation, the sound echoing through the modest center. George, sitting quietly beside him, seemed overwhelmed by the support. For years, he had been invisible to the world around him, but now he was at the center of a movement. As the applause died down, Trump stepped away with his team, preparing to leave. Outside, the reporters who had been waiting pounced on him with questions, many of which he ignored. However, one question stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. President, what's your next move to address police misconduct and homelessness?" He turned, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "My next move?" he repeated. "My next move is to make sure every person in this country, regardless of their circumstances, knows they matter. And that starts with action, not words. I'm taking this fight to Washington, to the local governments, and to every police department that thinks they're above the law. Watch closely. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." With that, he stepped into his limousine, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with hope and a media frenzy eager to report every detail. As the motorcade drove away, Trump's mind raced with plans. There were calls to make, meetings to arrange, and policies to draft. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. George Harper was safe, and his story was igniting change. It was a small victory, but one that carried the promise of something much larger. The days following the incident with George Harper saw a whirlwind of activity. The viral video of Donald Trump confronting the police officer had sparked national outrage. Protests erupted in cities across the country, demanding accountability and systemic reform. Social media platforms were flooded with stories from other veterans and marginalized individuals who had faced similar harassment. The hashtag #JusticeForGeorge trended for days, becoming a rallying cry for change. Trump, back in Washington, wasted no time channeling this momentum into action. In the Oval Office, he convened an emergency meeting with top advisors, civil rights leaders, and veterans advocates. The room was tense but determined, the air heavy with the gravity of the moment. Trump leaned forward in his chair, addressing the group. This isn't just about one officer or one department. This is about fixing a system that's been broken for too long. We're not just talking about justice for George Harper. We're talking about justice for everyone who's been ignored, mistreated, or left behind. One of the civil rights leaders, a woman named Angela Porter, spoke up. "Mr. President, this is an opportunity to set a precedent. We need stronger oversight of police departments, mandatory training on racial bias, and protections for vulnerable populations, especially veterans and the homeless." Trump nodded. "I agree. Draft me a plan for federal oversight, and I'll take it to Congress myself. We'll make it clear that this administration won't tolerate abuse of power." As the meeting continued, Trump's aides presented updates. The officer involved in the harassment of George Harper had been suspended pending an investigation, and the local police chief had issued a public apology under mounting pressure. However, Trump wasn't satisfied. "An apology isn't enough," he said firmly. "We need real consequences and systemic changes." Meanwhile, George Harper's story had become a symbol of resilience. Interviews with him, facilitated by veterans organizations, revealed the depth of his struggles and the broader challenges faced by homeless veterans. George spoke candidly about his time in the military, the explosion that had taken his sight, and the years of neglect that followed. His words resonated deeply, humanizing an issue that many had previously ignored. Trump decided to bring George to Washington as a guest of honor at a nationally televised town hall meeting. When George arrived, escorted by staff from the Veterans Center, the audience erupted in applause. Trump introduced him personally, recounting their encounter and emphasizing the importance of fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. George, initially hesitant, found his voice in front of the crowd. "For years I felt invisible," he said, his voice steady despite his visible nerves. "But now I see that people care. I see that change is possible. We have to keep fighting, not just for me, but for every veteran, every homeless person, every human being who's been pushed aside. We all deserve better." The audience gave him a standing ovation, and the event was broadcast across the nation. Trump used the platform to announce a sweeping executive order aimed at addressing police misconduct, improving resources for veterans, and establishing stricter federal oversight of law enforcement agencies. The order also included increased funding for veteran assistance programs and initiatives to combat homelessness. Over the next several weeks, the impact of these efforts became apparent. Local governments began adopting reforms modeled after Trump's executive order, and several police departments launched internal reviews to address systemic issues. Activists credited the viral moment with sparking a much-needed national conversation, while skeptics admitted that tangible steps were finally being taken. George Harper, meanwhile, became an advocate for homeless veterans, working closely with organizations to raise awareness and push for policy changes. He often spoke about the moment Trump stopped his motorcade to help him, describing it as the turning point in his life. "It wasn't just about me," he said in an interview. "It was about showing the world that no one is too small to matter." For Trump, the incident became a defining moment of his presidency. While critics continued to debate his motivations, few could deny the results. The image of him standing beside George Harper, holding a police officer accountable, remained etched in the public's memory as a rare example of decisive leadership. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum continued. Policies inspired by the executive order gained bipartisan support, and the national conversation shifted from outrage to action. George Harper's name became synonymous with resilience and hope, and his story was seen as a reminder that even the smallest voices could spark monumental change. In the end, what began as a single act of intervention grew into a movement that reshaped the way the country approached justice, equality, and accountability. For George, it was a second chance. For the nation, it was a step toward becoming what it had always aspired to be, a place where every individual, no matter how forgotten or invisible, was seen, heard, and valued. Justice begins with action. George's story is just one of many, but today it sparked a movement for change. What would you do if you saw injustice on the streets? Would you speak up or stay silent? Share your thoughts in the comments, like this video if you believe in justice, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Together, we can make a difference. Asterisk.